So why is there a need for humanitarian reform?
It's not just OCHA that thinks there's a need for humanitarian reform. A lot of organizations recognize that there has been a lot wrong with the system of international response to humanitarian emergencies. We saw in Darfur, in Sudan, in 2004, that there were a number of sectors that were badly covered in the initial stages of the response. For example, water and sanitation. It wasn't clear at the beginning who would be in charge of that sector, who was involved, what resources were available for that sector. In some of the other sectors, camp management for the internally displaced there, no agencies wanted to take responsibility for that in the early days. Protection, humanitarian protection, none of the agencies were willing to come forward, put staff on the ground and take the lead in developing strategies and organizing humanitarian protection in Darfur. Emergency shelter was another area. A few organizations said they were willing to chip in, but chipping in is not good enough when you've got hundreds of thousands or millions of lives at stake. And it was clear that not just in the case of Darfur, but in many different humanitarian emergencies, there were major gaps in the system of humanitarian response. You've got clear leads in certain sectors. For example, you've got the United Nations World Food Programme for food. You've got the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. You've got UNICEF for children, but you've got the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. But for many other sectors, it wasn't clear who was going to take the lead. There's no United Nations High Commissioner for Internally Displaced Persons. There's no World Water and Sanitation Program. So we had to do something about the system that had too many holes in it.
Okay, so what did you do?
Well, that's when we decided to commission an independent evaluation of humanitarian response capacity at the global level, find out what capacity really is out there, and take it from there. So we carried out this independent evaluation, and this evaluation that looked not just at Darfur, but it looked at the response to the tsunami. It was looking at emergency operations in countries like Liberia and Somalia and the Congo and many other countries. This evaluation showed that yes, it was true that there were big gaps in certain sectors, and it proposed new ways of addressing some of those gaps. It also showed us that the whole system of partnership between UN organizations and non-UN humanitarian actors, the NGOs, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, the International Organization for Migration, all these different actors, the system wasn't working very well. Individual organizations were often doing a great job, but overall partnership between these organizations was not good. The UN had become very good at using some of these NGOs as subcontractors or as implementing partners, as we sometimes call them. The UN was not always so good at seeing these organizations as strategic partners. And yet that is what they should be today, because in many of today's emergencies, these NGOs do the bulk of the work. It's interesting that in Darfur, in the early days of the response there were more staff from Médecins Sans Frontières than the entire United Nations system put together. More MSF staff in Darfur than all the United Nations agencies put together. And yet, at that time, the central decision-making body for the humanitarian operation was the UN country team, meeting in isolation. So the bulk of the work being done by the NGOs, the bulk of the planning, the advocacy, the leadership at the government level was being done by the UN. Something was wrong. We needed to find a better way to work together with all our different partners. So this evaluation of humanitarian response capacity put forward a number of different proposals. ways of improving humanitarian response, and that's what eventually led to what we now call the humanitarian reform process.
So is this just about the UN putting its own house in order?
No, this is not just about the UN. In fact, this reform is anchored in the Interagency Standing Committee. That is a body that we have at the global level, which brings together UN organizations, NGOs, the Red Cross, Red Crescent Movement, IOM, the World Bank, different actors. It brings them all together in one central policy-making, decision-making body. It's called the Interagency Standing Committee. And this reform is an IASC reform. It's not a UN reform program. There is a separate process of UN reform, which people know a lot about. It's often on the news. This is broader than a UN reform. It's about the way the whole, it's about the whole international system of response to humanitarian emergencies.
What will be the differences after the reform is implemented?
Okay, so the reform has three main components. The first component is that of strengthening leadership in humanitarian emergencies. It's strengthening the humanitarian coordination system. In many countries, in 25 countries around the world at this moment, we have UN humanitarian coordinators. In fact, they're not just UN. These are people who are employed by the UN, but they represent the broader international humanitarian community. And these humanitarian coordinators are responsible for overseeing and leading humanitarian operations in the 25 countries that they're posted in. We also have UN resident coordinators in many other countries, and many of these are disaster-prone countries. When we have new emergencies in these countries, a new earthquake, a hurricane, flooding, or even a new outbreak of conflict or violence in a particular country, where we have a new emergency, the resident coordinator is responsible for coordinating, for overseeing the coordination of the international response to that emergency. And so that's one component of the reform, is strengthening the leadership. Another component of the reform is improving the whole system of humanitarian financing. There's different ways of doing this, and in many ways we're only just starting out on this process. But one new mechanism that is often talked about is the Central Emergency Response Fund, or it goes by its acronym SURF. The SURF is a fund that we now have at the global level. It's managed by OCHA, and the idea is that this fund will have a total of $500 million in it, and this money can be used for two different purposes. First, for responding to new emergencies. So we now have a pot of money that's available to be used in the first hours or days of an emergency. In the past, it often took us a long time to mobilize the necessary resources in new emergencies. Now we have a pot of money which can be called upon and used right at the beginning of a new emergency. That money can also be used to fund operations in some of the more neglected emergencies. In the past, we've often complained that donors have put a lot of attention to some of the big emergencies where CNN, the BBC are all following these emergencies. Others have been much more neglected. So this money can be used both for the neglected emergencies and to kickstart operations in new emergencies. That's the second component of the reform. And then the third component of the reform is about improving response at the sectoral level. And that's what has come to be known as the cluster approach.